Okay, so today what we're going to get into are some critiques of public choice theory. Now, it should be pointed out that a lot, and by a lot I mean a lot, of people really do not like it. Okay, and you might ask the question, well, why not? Okay, and to my mind, I can think of two kind of main reasons. One reason is something that we've kind of talked about this semester a little bit. One is that public choice theory, which I'll just abbreviate PCT, can be used as a tool of sort of, I'm going to call it social control, but I don't mean like social control, or I don't really mean it the way you're probably thinking of social control. In other words, we'll come back to that a little bit. And then the second one is it seriously challenges a lot of what we learn in, for example, high school civics. Or if you call it government class or anything like that. Public choice theory really kind of challenges a lot of notions that we learn about in that class. Okay, and so let's kind of just go through these one at a time. Okay, so let's start here. The tool for social control. All right, this one to me is a little bit obvious. So remember, if you think back to when we were going through this stuff for one of the first times, one of the things that we kind of talked about was that different voting models can often lead to different outcomes. Okay. And this, in and of itself, isn't a terribly scary thing. But the challenge or the danger comes, with what if someone gains control or maybe is able to select the voting model. Right? What if you remember back to that cycling problem, what if they get to choose the order in which votes happen? Right? On a similar note, one thing that's really fun to think about and is kind of a leading area in public choice research is what about bundling bills together? Okay, so this is since we're in 2020 right now, and we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. This is the best probably exemplified by the CARES Act. Okay, so the CARES Act was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Trump not that long ago. And I believe it's about a $2 trillion spending package. And it's meant to help alleviate the suffering of people, the economic suffering, obviously not the medical suffering, the economic suffering of people around the United States. But in it contains a lot of strange things, like what we typically call pork barrel spending. Okay, so there's money for the post office in this. It's not tied to anything to do with coronavirus. It's just there's additional money outlaid for post office. There's a lot of money going to bail out certain banks and certain companies. Now, there are arguments that they are perhaps hit. I'll put a link to a really good, in my mind, podcast showing or discussing some of the different sides on our course's website for you, and I'll put it in the description below as well. But there's a lot of things that aren't really related to coronavirus in this coronavirus act that we're using to try to get lots of things done. This typically comes in, you'll see provisions for national defense in bills that are ostensibly, put forth to do things with like national defense, right? So I'm sorry for education spending. So basically, you'll see a lot of additional stipulations in bills that have to do with either national defense or education. Right. So anytime you see a bill that's about either of these two things here, you should probably try to get a copy of the bill and see kind of like what else is in there, because for the most part, everyone's going to vote yes on national defense, right? Because it's like, hey, support the troops, right? And everyone's going to vote yes on education. And so if you can put something into that bill as well, then that's going to pass too. Okay, so there are a lot of interesting things that can be done, to basically, one way to think about this is what you're doing is you're hacking, in some sense, the democratic process. Okay, and this is where a lot of the critiques of public choice theory is that it gives people a lens or an ability to analyze situations and come up with things that are perhaps advantageous to particular people. Okay, so it's not really saying like, it's not about social control in the sense that I'm going like the people who understand public choice theory are trying to like rule the universe or anything like that. But it is, or it can sometimes be used to understand how one could get things passed. In Michigan right now, one of the interesting things is so right now, so this is the year 2020, right? We have Governor Whitmer, who is a Democrat, and then the legislature, I believe, is controlled by the Republicans. But an interesting fact about this is a quorum is reached in the legislature, is reached at, I believe, 20 people. Okay, so if 20 people are in the chambers of the legislature, then it is constituted as a quorum, and a quorum is empowered to do basically whatever, has the full rights and privileges and powers of the full legislative assembly. And so one thing that is perhaps troubling is, with this coronavirus scare, there was talk at one point about letting one member of Michigan's Congress or legislature into the building at a time, and then once there were 20 people in the room, then it would be a quorum and they would be able to vote on things. Well, if the Michigan legislature is today primarily or a majority Republican, but what if let's say 15 Democrats and 5 Republicans come into the chamber and then they vote on something? Well, all of a sudden, even though the Michigan legislature has, as a whole, a Republican tilt or whatever you want to call it, well, then all of a sudden now the Democrat members have the tilt in Congress, and that can very easily completely change what is done. So these types of things, there's speculation, and I'm trying to be very careful to weigh in on this as objectively as I can. There's speculation that Governor Whitmer is trying to use this time to get a Democrat majority as the quorum so that different things can be passed that might not be passed if the full legislature is there. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. Excuse me. I've just heard on alarmist and conspiracy theory websites that this may or may not be true. Okay, so that's one aspect in which the public choice theory can be used to understand strategies that could be made to alter democratic outcomes, which is probably something that we want to avoid. The one that I want to spend the most emphasis on is the challenging high school civics class. Okay. And it turns out that a lot of people just don't like it when you point that out, right? Democracy, at least in the United States, is typically viewed, as a sacrosanct institution. It's given some sort of like a almost like godlike or deified position of group decision making, where if you have a problem, you can just solve it democratically, right? Just vote on it, or just give everyone equal speaking time or equal representation or anything to like that. And that's not false. I don't want to belittle that, right? But to even question this seems to be to question everything that makes America, America, right? And that's kind of a weird thing. Now, this sounds flippant, and I don't mean it that way, but it does seem to be pretty true. People in America tend to just love democracy. Why do you think we spend so much time, trying to export democracy, around the world, right? Which is a weird way to phrase it, right? We're not building institutions, we're exporting democracy, right? And so if you see a problem in society, obviously solve it democratically, right? At some level, it's viewed as sort of the penicillin of the social world, right? And you just kind of gotta like smear it on there, and whatever social problem you have, well, it'll be solved. Okay, which is weird. It's not some weird thing. Or I guess another way to kind of say this is to use a familiar analogy that Jim Buchanan liked to use. So Jim Buchanan was one of the founders of public choice theory way back in the 1950s and 60s. He won a Nobel Prize, I believe in 1986, could have been 84, I can't really remember. But he won the Nobel Prize for his work in public choice theory, founded the entire field basically. And he liked to always think about what he was doing was just removing sort of like the rose-tinted glasses that we all kind of look through the world, or look through to see the world when we look at what is taught in high school civics. Okay, and so what he means by this, so if you think back to like what you may have learned in civics class, you probably learned about like checks and balances, right? You probably learned that Congress was a place where like debate happens, right? Oftentimes it's reasoned debate. Apparently I need to get a refund or something for my taxes or God knows what, so thank God, right? But Congress is typically viewed as a place where reasoned debate happens, and so the floor of Congress is this place where the senators or the congressmen or congresspeople come together and discuss things in a cool and level-headed way. Well, here's kind of the litmus test, or what I would love for you guys to do. Go turn on like C-SPAN at any time of the day and just see if you see reasoned debate or if you see what I'm going to call partisan bickering. Okay, so is it reasoned or bickering? Okay, or here's my other favorite thing. If you see the floor or the chamber and someone on the television, giving a talk, here's kind of a dirty secret. There's only about 6 people in the room. Right, and those people would be the person giving the talk, right? Typically, they have an aide. There's what's called a stenographer, and the stenographer's job is to basically type up the transcript of everything that is said verbatim on the floor of the House or the Senate. And then there is typically the in the House, it would be the Speaker of the House. In the Senate, it would be the President of the Senate, or the Senate Majority Leader. But typically, they don't even do it. So you can have a title called the President pro tempore, which is the person that the actual Senate Majority Leader or the actual Speaker of the House will designate as the current Speaker or President of the chamber, and they are the ones that are now the presiding officer. Okay, typically this is given to freshmen as an attempt to sort of teach them the procedures of the floor and of the chamber, because there are very strict procedural rules. This is why you'll hear things like the chair now recognizes the gentle lady or the gentlewoman from South Carolina or whatever. Okay, and then the gentle person will respond back like, "Thank you, Mr. Speaker," or "Thank you, Miss, Lady Speaker," or "Madam Speaker," whatever it is, and then they'll go into their argument and they'll say fancy things like, "I yield back the remainder of the balance of my time," or blah blah blah. Right? This is typically done. This right here, assigning freshmen to be the president pro tempore of the chamber, is typically done to try to teach them, how to do everything. Okay, but here's the issue. A lot of people get really upset when you point out like this is how Congress is done, and they say, "No, you're attacking American institutions. How dare you do something like this?" Now, public choice theory does like to point out what a lot of people refer to as the incentive problem. Okay, and this harks back to what some people interpret Friedrich Hayek as saying as Hayek's knowledge problem, if you're familiar with that. I'll say it's a parallel to that. Okay. And basically, what public choice theory might be suggesting is that the incentive of the politicians or the would-be politicians is to get, I'm going to say or just elected. Right? Now, sometimes that lines up with the interests of the nation or state or whatever. Right? Sometimes those things are perfectly in line. Sometimes they're not. I'm going to say not so much. Okay? And so the question then becomes, given that the politician is the one doing the actual choosing and the actual choices, are they going to respond to the incentive to do what's right for the nation, or are they going to do what's in their incentive to get reelected? Okay, and this leads to some fun tensions that are great to explore. Thomas Stratman does. Likes to explore this type of stuff, and I'll link to some of his papers in the comment section below as well. This is one of those things that is an empirical question. Thomas does his best to answer it empirically, and basically what the opponents of public choice theory seem to be arguing is that public choice suggests that government is inefficient because politicians only want to do what gets them reelected, and that being evil increases their chances of being reelected. Now, that's not what public choice theory says, but that's oftentimes how it's interpreted. Okay, and you get into what we can call concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, which we'll get into in a later lecture or a later video as well. Okay, now a couple of things to kind of go into. So first, as we'll sort of talk about in the next series of videos when we dive into Brian Kaplan's book, The Myth of the Rational Voter. Which I'll link to in the description as well. This isn't, necessarily a bad thing. Second, it might even be true. It might not even be true. A lot of politicians really are not evil scumbags. In fact, a lot of them really are very nice people who genuinely want to help. So in my career, I've been fortunate enough to have a couple opportunities to work in the U.S. Congress, and I've gotten to meet, several congressmen and several congresswomen, in that capacity, and I haven't really come across anyone who was actually evil. I've come across people that I disagreed with, but I've never met anyone who was, well and truly evil. There's probably some amount of evil in the world, and there's probably some amount of evil in Congress, but to me, it seems like it's much lower than people seem to perhaps think, or people seem to think that public choice economists think. Now, more critically, this isn't, what Buchanan had in mind when he was discussing and laying out the groundwork for public choice theory. Okay, so, a lot of people will do, for example, what you could call optimal tax literature, which is basically a way to try to figure out what sort of the best tax code would be. And Buchanan had sort of this really cool way of, at least cool to me, way of thinking about things. And Buchanan, he never really cared about policy per se. What he instead cared about was like the process by which policy came about. Okay, or another way to kind of think of it is that he viewed democracy as a discussion, not a mechanism. Okay, my dissertation advisor was a guy named Richard Wagner, who I've mentioned on this series, several times already. And Richard had Jim as one of his professors in graduate school way back in the 40s, 50s, somewhere around there. And he tells this story of how on the first day of class, Buchanan asked the class, hey, how do we fix the tax code, right? And Wagner stood up and gave an answer that was very elaborate and relied on lots of mathematics, and he derived all kinds of stuff on the board. And the salient point is that Buchanan's response was to say that we are Democrats, not autocrats. Okay, and so Buchanan was really all about this constitutional and post-constitutional stuff. So what Buchanan was really about was, can we find a process that everyone agrees is fair? Okay, and if you can, then you should implement that process. Now, people might disagree with the conclusions reached by that process, but they would agree to the process by which it happened. Okay, so you might think perhaps that if you play a sport, you might think that your coach did something wrong, but you might also agree that your coach, has the right to make the choices that he or she makes. Okay, so even if you disagree with your coach on a particular decision, you have agreed to do what your coach says, right? You might, if you have if your school has like a student senate or something like that, you might not agree with what the student senate does, but you might agree with the process by which they arrived at that conclusion, or for those of you that live in a community with a homeowners association, your homeowners association might, not let you put a particular mailbox that you really want, which is something that did happen to me a few years ago. So you might not agree, or you might want to put a different mailbox out in front of your house, but you agree that the homeowners association has the best interest of the neighborhood in mind, and then you agree with the process by which they arrived at the decision of what mailboxes you are allowed and not allowed to put up. Okay, and so Buchanan's main thought was that the problem in DC wasn't so much the outcomes that came about, but how those outcomes came about. He recognized that an awful lot of people dislike what DC, and by extension what lots of national governments do. He recognized that people didn't like what they were doing, and he also reasoned that if people knew how these national governments actually operated, they disprove of that too. And so his goal, he thought that we could do better. So Buchanan thinks that we can do better. Now, this doesn't mean that we can do better policy-wise, but he says that we could do better from a system of how government operates. We could do better in that regard. Now, this, might mean that policies come out that Buchanan or you or I don't like. But if we can find some common ground in how those policies do come about, that would be a much bigger improvement, and there would, in principle, at least it seems, it would seem like there would be a lot better, social cohesion, I guess you could call it. Okay, and so, right now, you hear politicians saying that Washington, D.C. is broken, or they want to drain the swamp, or whatever. Well, that sentiment is saying that the democratic process that we experience, that we live under, is flawed, and that we want to change it. Okay, or to borrow a sports analogy, if your favorite team loses, but the game was officiated fairly and the rules are fair and just, then you're not mad about the game. You're just mad about the skill or the abilities of your team's players. Okay, but if the game was not officiated fairly, or if the rules are unfair or unjust in some way, then there's a really big problem. Okay, so Buchanan was all about the rules of the game, not so much the outcome of the game itself.